Well, ladies and gentlemen, in this video, we are going to be looking at the 5 strangest stadiums that have hosted a home and away VFL/AFL game for premiership points. Now, it could be the location, it could be the configuration of the stadium itself, or it could just be a weird one-off game at a strange ground. Now, before we get into this, if you have been enjoying my videos, please consider subscribing to the channel. It does help me to keep making the videos. I really appreciate all the support you guys have given me so far with the channel. Now, let's get into it in no particular order. The first stadium on the list, it is going to be Jiangwan Stadium in Shanghai, China. Port Adelaide did play 3 games in this stadium between 2017 and 2019. And it was a diplomatic strategy to bring China and Australia together through sport to develop business and political investment and opportunities between the two nations. Now, these games were televised in China. Port and the AFL did receive some sponsorship dollars from Chinese organisations because of these games. And in terms of the crowds, they did get around 10,000 on average to each game. The crowd was majority Australian expats and tourists. There were a lot of free tickets given out to locals, but I'm not sure how many locals actually cared or paid money to attend these games. I do think there was minimal support from the local community, which really should come as no surprise to anyone. There have been a lot of sports that have struggled to crack the Chinese market, and realistically, Australian rules football would be a long way down the list for the Chinese public. Now, the arrangement was meant to continue after the 2019 game, but the 2020 event was cancelled due to the pandemic. And we know the issues that were coming out of China in the year 2020. And the AFL has not gone back to China since. There was some talk at the start of 2024 about potentially going back in the future. I think there was some interest from David Koch and Port Adelaide, but personally I doubt that happens. The stadium itself was built in 1934 and it was mainly used as an athletics stadium. You do see there is a cool old school grandstand there built in the Art Deco style. The playing surface itself was very big because they did originally have a running track around it. For the AFL games, they did install temporary seating behind each end. It did look very strange, a very weird stadium, you've got to say. And in fact, the whole China situation was very weird. Looking back on it, it almost feels like a fever dream. And it's easy to forget that this did actually happen. The next stadium on the list is Canberra Stadium in the ACT, formerly known as Bruce Stadium. Now, we do know this today as a rectangular rugby and rugby league ground, home of the Canberra Raiders and the Brumbies in the Super Rugby. But in the 90s, it was actually in an oval configuration. And it did host one AFL game in the 1995 season between Fitzroy and the West Coast Eagles. Now, I couldn't find any photos of the game, but I did find this old video of a rugby league game. And you can see the old configuration of the ground, the big area behind the goals in the oval shape. The stadium did get a renovation not long after that 1995 AFL game, where it did get turned into a rectangular stadium before the 2000 Sydney Olympics, where it did host some of the soccer games for that event. And we know the AFL games now in Canberra are played at Manuka Oval. I do like the stadium. It was a good move to get out of that multi-purpose arena. And hopefully one day we do see a Canberra team in the AFL. The next stadium is the Melbourne Motordrome, a former speedway located in what is now Olympic Park in Melbourne. It did open all the way back in 1924, and it did contain a grass oval on the inside of the racetrack. And they hosted car and motorbike races on the racetrack, and they did play some local football and cricket on the oval on the inside of the track. And the VFL was actually keen to purchase the ground and take ownership of it. They did schedule several games to be played there in the 1931 season, but the games were moved because of a dispute between the VFL and the owners at the time of the Motordrome. And the Melbourne Football Club ultimately played 3 games at the Motordrome early in the 1932 season because the MCG was being resurfaced at the time. And there was actually plans to play 1 game every week there until 1940. However, no more games were played there due to a dispute with the local councils where the VFL club's home grounds were located. And those local councils were worried that they would lose revenue if they lost those VFL games, and they actually threatened to kick the clubs out of their home grounds if they did go ahead with the plans to play at the Motordrome. And funnily enough, the stadium did actually have electric floodlights, and it did host a night exhibition game in the 1935 pre-season between Richmond and South Melbourne. And that would have to be one of the earliest night games ever played, you would think. Ultimately, this stadium was demolished and they built the Olympic Park Stadium for the 1956 Melbourne Olympics. And we remember that stadium as being the home ground of the Storm in the NRL before Amy Park was built. The fourth stadium on the list is Yallourn Oval. And Yallourn was a company town in Victoria around 140 kilometres east of Melbourne, near the town of Moe. The town was actually built between 1921 and 1961 for employees of the State Electricity Commission of Victoria to live in while they worked on the Yallourn Power Station, which was a nearby coal-fired power station. And the population of the town was only around 5,000 at its peak. The town oval hosted one VFL game in the 1952 season between Footscray and St Kilda. And the reason for that is in round 8 of 1952, the VFL held National Day Round, where they did play games in various grounds around the country that did not normally host VFL football. And the idea was they would promote the sport and the league itself to different markets. Now, the other games were played in Brisbane, Sydney, Hobart, Albury and Euroa. And it's strange that the VFL chose such an obscure town and obscure ground to host a game at, being Yallourn. The attendance for the game was only about 3,500, and unfortunately we don't really have any images of the game itself. But I did manage to find some old photos of the ground. And the reason this is such an obscure stadium is the oval and the actual whole town of Yallourn were demolished because they did expand the coal mine that the town was built around. And the demolition of the town and the oval was complete by the year 1983. And no one really knows why they picked the towns that they did pick for this event. I did do some digging through the history books, and it seems the question was being asked even back in 1952. And the last stadium on the list, it is Sky Stadium in Wellington, New Zealand, formerly known as Westpac Stadium. And this stadium did host 3 St Kilda games between 2013 and 2015, and they played those games on Anzac Day due to the shared history and significance of Anzac Day between Australia and New Zealand. Of course, New Zealand being one of the 3 countries which has hosted an AFL game for points, along with China that we did talk about earlier in the video. Now, the ground holds around 34,000 people. It's mainly used for rugby, cricket and soccer, but the advantage of this ground for AFL is that it is in an oval configuration, so it definitely works for Aussie rules. It has held various low-level Aussie rules games over the years. I think the under-18s play a representative game over there, or at least they have in the past, as well as the New Zealand national team. In terms of AFL games, the crowds were actually pretty decent in the first game in the year 2013 between Sydney and St Kilda. They got around 22,000 that night, but in the next 2 years, the crowds really did fall away significantly. And ultimately, St Kilda exited the New Zealand agreement after 2015, having lost all 3 of the games that were played in Wellington. So sort of a fun little video to look back on some of these strange grounds, guys. But that is all we're going to have time for today. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more.